transition of West Papua, West Irian, to the control of the Indonesians. And then once that is done, use the centralized Indonesian military to overthrow Sukarno and replace him with a U.S. puppet. But the problem was there was a new president coming in after Eisenhower, John Kennedy, who had different plans. And so this becomes a major point of tension as Kennedy confronts the American deep state. We'll get into that on a later episode. But this whole episode with the Outer Islands Rebellion and the Indonesia policy under Eisenhower, this was pivotal in terms of the eventual outcome for Indonesia that we'll get into at a later date. And this is just more examples of clandestine, top-down, Wall Street overworld influence and control over the U.S. empire in a way that's totally undemocratic and very much imperial and lawless. And this is a really important chapter to understand the history of the U.S. empire. And I will come back to Indonesia, and we'll see how this is of a piece with other aspects of the Eisenhower era U.S. empire.
So there's still a lot more to say about Indonesia. We've been referencing the 65-66 massacre of the genocide, which the CIA directly supported, and then the CIA also admitted it was one of the bloodiest atrocities of the 20th century. There's a lot more to get to. I know we're going to come back to Indonesia when we talk about JFK and LBJ, but there's another country that was pivotal in the non-aligned movement. We talked about the leadership role of Sukarno of Indonesia in helping to create the non-aligned movement. Another leader was Nasser, the leftist anti-imperialist leader of Egypt. And Egypt was also targeted by the Eisenhower administration. So we talked about Iran, Guatemala, Vietnam, Indonesia. Now let's talk about Egypt and Eisenhower's foreign policy.
Yeah, Egypt is today a pivotal area, and back then it was too in terms of global geopolitics. And this had long been a key point of the British Empire to maintain control over Egypt, because Egypt is where the Suez Canal was, and the Suez Canal was the main entry for to get to British colonies in India, to get to Britain's big gas station in Iran later, and to deal with the China trade in opium, which has made the empire extremely rich around the same time that the U.S. or that the British Empire dialed down the slave trade, which it had a monopoly on until it didn't, and then it crushed the transatlantic slave trade. Then the U.S. Then the top imperial cash cow for Britain was the opium trade, which involved a sort of trade between British holdings in India and then selling opium to the Chinese. Suez Canal later when it's completed, becomes important for that too, as I understand it. And in the 1950s, you had this guy named Nasser who comes to power. The U.S. in the region had supported Israel in 1948, and so this was not popular among Egyptians, and especially nationalists. Nationalism in Egypt had been brewing for a while before World War II. Afterwards, with decolonization, it was kind of a matter of time before the puppet monarch of Egypt, this King Farouk fellow, would get deposed, and he did in 1952 a coup led by Abdel Nasser, a general in the Egyptian military. And he was a nationalist, not a communist, but someone who favored socialist, economic plans. And he also promoted pan-Arabism, or you could call it Nasserism sometimes. This just meant he thought that the Middle East and the Arab world had been dominated and used as imperial pawns for too long, and he wanted to change that. And he supported nationalism across Arabia, and Egypt. Syria was on the side of Nasser for a while. So this was a guy whose plans were terrifying to the people, to the Anglo-U.S. empire. In 1954, he's consolidated his power, and he sets up a secular socialist government. He enacted land reform, and he made it clear that Egypt was going for sovereignty over the Suez Canal. In the 1950s, if you want to look at that bellwether of the American deep state, Time magazine, whose publisher is like the American Century guy, pretty much a PR man for the American deep state. They have a cover with Nasser on it. And when I first saw this the other day, I don't know why I never Googled it before, because Time is always so useful. But when I first brought it up, I thought, well, that's surprisingly, reasonable for Time magazine. Just a picture of Nasser smiling, and it's not as over the top. But then I look in the background, and there's these like ancient Egyptian carvings it wasn't Photoshop back then, right? But they have them holding like a rifle with a bayonet and a Molotov cocktail. And so you're already getting the sort of like low key Orientalism on display here for Time magazine. And I think that we're supposed to be a little bit scared of the swarthy, primitive people of out there in non-America, non-Europe. That's a part of what's going on. So Nasser's a fly in the ointment for these people in all that conflict.
Yeah, and this leads up to the Suez Crisis in 1956, in which again these European colonial powers are trying to control the Suez Canal. It's also where Israel starts playing a key role in these destabilization operations, basically as a Western colony in the heart of West Asia. But what's interesting about Nasser is he was himself, of course, a Muslim, but he was also deeply secular. He was not antagonistic to Islam, but he was not an Islamist. He didn't want Islam to be involved in the political system. And this is where you start seeing the birth of British and US intelligence agencies supporting Islamist groups, groups that support political Islam. Again, Nasser was a Muslim, but this is where you start seeing the US and the British Empire supporting these Islamist groups, and of course that has huge repercussions for today because this eventually leads to Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban, which were also fostered and sponsored by CIA and MI6. So anyway, talk more about Nasser's policies, and people probably have seen there's these famous videos of him where he's arguing with religious ideologues about who want to force their daughters to wear a hijab veil. And then he says, well, why don't you force your own daughters to wear a hijab and tell them they can't get education? So he did have this very like progressive form of nationalism and a progressive interpretation of Islam. And we know that the U.S. empire has been waging war against any kind of progressive form of Islam for decades, because progressive forms of Islam tend to be associated with anti-imperialism. That's why they want the reactionary medieval forms that support imperialism.
Right, and you have to go back to the Brits to see how the U.S. picked up this policy. The Brits supported the original jihadi international Islamist guy whose name was Al-Afghani, and who apparently was an atheist who who believed that you should just use religion to manipulate people for social purposes and social control. And there's sort of a straight line leading up to the sort of infamous group that gets established by the Brits in 1928, and that would be the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is founded in 1928 with a land grant from the Suez Canal Company, which is a major part of the British Empire. And why would these Brits who are running this imperial project, which is decidedly not Islamist, it's not like London, the Queen has converted to Islam, so why are they supporting and creating and backing this Muslim Brotherhood group? And it was a way to counter nationalists and socialists who would be against British rule. You create this other force that's who doesn't profess loyalty to Britain or imperialism. They pose as anti-imperialists, but they're able to be manipulated by British imperialists, and that's who's ultimately funding them. And this is where you see the parallels between what Al-Qaeda ends up doing and so on. And one part of this was the secret apparatus of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was essentially a paramilitary or terrorist arm, and the Brits could use them to assassinate leaders. They provided security at one of King Farouk's like coronation ceremonies. They were just pawns of the Muslim Brotherhood. So the Brits are the originals for this, and that's who the British wanted to use against Nasser. So for the US, they're going to absorb the British Empire and sort of stage a hostile takeover of the British Empire and relegate Britain to kind of sidekick status for the US empire. And the Brits, as you see, try to resist this in some ways, but they're not able to. The British and the US likewise were threatened a little bit by Nasser's nationalism, and for the Brits specifically, the nationalization of the Suez Canal. In 1954, Nasser bans the Muslim Brotherhood, who the British had used to try to assassinate Nasser. So Nasser recognized that these guys were British tools and that they were going to kill him if they got the chance. The CIA also wanted Nasser neutralized, so here they are working on the same page. There's a famous picture, or it's not maybe super famous, but it's a notable picture of Eisenhower's White House, and he's visiting with people from the Middle East, Muslims, and one of them is Saeed Ramadan, who was the most prominent spokesman of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s, and was, according to Swiss intelligence, there was a document found which assessed that Ramadan had to have been a CIA agent, essentially. That he was backed by the U.S. So the Muslim Brotherhood at this time is backed by the U.S. And so this is a way for the U.S. to weaponize Islam and use it to advance its goals, just like it backs other people like Bandera in Ukraine and other Nazis and stuff in Europe, and fascists from Italy, and Japanese ultra-rightists. Anybody who is going to help them and be useful as tools to especially go after socialists, they'll make use of. And that was the relationship between the Brits and the Muslim Brotherhood, and then later the U.S. picks that up.
Yeah, this history is very interesting because today the Muslim Brotherhood has become one of the main political enemies of the Persian Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which declare it to be a so-called terrorist organization. Qatar actually is the main sponsor, along with Turkey, of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it shows these splits within West Asia and North Africa. But what's interesting is that in the early days, the Muslim Brotherhood helped give birth to a lot of these extremist Islamist groups. And you mentioned Saeed Ramadan. I mean, he was actually the son-in-law of Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this also gives birth to Sayyid Qutb and eventually Osama bin Laden and others. A name that's come up a lot in the series, of course, Khashoggi. We know that Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed by Saudi Arabia, he was a longtime Muslim Brotherhood activist and was also working with Qatar. And he was also a close friend of Osama bin Laden. And in the 1980s, he was the liaison for the Arab Mujahideen and CIA and Pakistani intelligence ISI, and a so-called journalist working for Arab News, which was like a Saudi propaganda mouthpiece. And there's photos of him, black and white photos of Jamal Khashoggi with like an assault rifle with other Mujahideen. So the Muslim Brotherhood has tried to rebrand itself as like more moderate and supporting constitutionalism and bourgeois democracy, especially in Egypt when there was, the first election after the overthrow of Mubarak. And, they said that we believe in bourgeois democracy. It's a complicated, interesting history. But anyway, we don't have time to get into all of that. Just wanted to mention some of that context because it helps explain the situation we're living in today. But another key historical moment in the Eisenhower administration and also with Nasser was the Suez Crisis. Talk about how this was incredibly important, not only for the U.S., but it was also, I think, an important point in which the U.S. empire told the French and British empires who is really boss now. It was a moment in which the U.S. empire asserted its hegemony over European imperialism. That's not unlike the situation we see now with Ukraine.
Right. The U.S., as I said, did end up staging a hostile takeover of the British Empire, and this there was the sterling pound crisis, and the way that the U.S. handled the transition to basically U.S. dollar hegemony and getting rid of the sterling area for the Brits. The fact that they never wrote off the debts from World War I and World War II. That they insisted on collecting them, which was a departure from past wars between allies. There's the U.S. just essentially took this over through the two world wars, resulted in the U.S. taking over the British Empire. That's one big consequence of it. So, but they're still holding on to, in the 50s, they still have tenuous control over Iran, although that's fading away because of Mossadegh. The coup basically makes it a U.S. puppet instead of a British one in 1953, which we've already talked about. And they also had the Suez Canal, but that was being taken away by this Nasser fellow who they really hated. And as a result of Nasser's nationalization of the British-owned Suez Canal, you have the Suez crisis of 1956, which may extend in 1957, but it's usually dated as 1956. And the UK, France, and Israel try to seize the Suez Canal by force. And you can see the path that they take here. And this is you look at this map and you think of the strategic importance of these areas, and you start to understand why Israel was established as a tool of the British Empire initially, why the Balfour Declaration would have been issued in the first place. Britain's had all these plans that we've talked about between the wars, and then Israel does get established. And here you can see that it can act as a cat's paw against this Nasser fellow in this very strategic region. They try to seize the canal, and this puts Eisenhower in a strange position. At this point in time, the British Prime Minister went as far as wanting to get Nasser assassinated, and typically these things are not recorded. It's rare that the president is known to have authorized an assassination of a foreign head of state. I think we know that Eisenhower did okay the assassination of Lumumba, but then the official CIA position is that somebody else did it because they failed, but that's not really plausible. Here you have British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, direct quote. He says, "What's all this nonsense about isolating Nasser or neutralizing him, as you call it? I want him destroyed. Can't you understand? I want him murdered. And I don't give a damn. There's anarchy and chaos in Egypt. After he's dead, I want you to dig up his body and put his head on a pike on the Tower of London like Oliver Cromwell. God save the Queen." The last part he didn't say the stuff about Cromwell, but the rest of it is a direct quote, which I wrote here. And these guys, this is the stakes for them. They were like, we need to kill this guy. Stop saying liquidate, murder him, right? This is what they're saying. So